All right, well, let's go to the top end where we're joined by our Sky News Northern Australia correspondent, Matt Cunningham. Matt, welcome to the program. I want to ask you first about this tropical cyclone Jasper, which was upgraded to a Category 2 storm. There's tens of thousands of people without electricity, reports of flash flooding. What's the latest, and is this going to get worse?
Well, we'll find out in the next couple of hours, I think, James, because the eye of that cyclone is just crossing the Queensland coast as we speak, right near Cape Tribulation, so about halfway between Port Douglas and Cooktown. Now, as you say, it's intensified into a Category 2 cyclone. We're talking about winds here of 100 kilometres an hour and wind gusts of up to 140 kilometres per hour. So residents in that area, all the way down to Cairns, are in for a pretty hairy time for the next few hours, I would suspect. I mean, I've lived through a couple of Category 2 cyclones here in Darwin, and I can tell you it's no fun. So I think it's important that people in that area of far north Queensland are listening to authorities now and are taking the necessary precautions as that cyclone passes through. Now, we will see some pretty heavy rainfall across the top end of far north Queensland and then across into the Northern Territory, I suspect, over the next few days and into next week as that system moves across. But we really are at that important time now, James, as that cyclone is crossing the coast there in far north Queensland.
Well, we certainly hope everybody there is staying safe and is all right after that. And yes, do listen to authorities. But now let's move on to another story here. Shadow Indigenous Australians Minister Jacinta Price has called out the Prime Minister for being missing in action on Indigenous issues since the failure of his voice referendum in October. Matt, you're in Darwin, where there are several pressing issues when it comes to Aboriginal populations. I spoke with her about this yesterday. She told me that in Alice Springs, there's been a lot of money that has been earmarked, but they've seen very little on the ground, and that trouble often comes during the summer, which is, of course, what we're heading into now. Is Jacinta Price correct that Anthony Albanese has basically been MIA on Aboriginal issues since losing the voice?
Well, she's right that we haven't heard a lot from the Prime Minister since probably a week or so after the referendum and the failure of that referendum to get over the line. I would argue, though, James, that I don't think we hear enough from Prime Ministers generally on this issue, and I don't think we see enough interest from many of our politicians on the issues that are affecting Aboriginal Australians. In the past 10 years, I'd say, with the honourable exception of Tony Abbott, who spent a week in a remote community in each of the 2 years that he was Prime Minister, I don't think Prime Ministers generally have treated the issue with the seriousness that it deserves. I mean, you know, I could run you off a list now of the crises that exist in Indigenous affairs in the Northern Territory. Do you want to talk about the levels of remote education, school attendance? Do you want to talk about diabetes? Do you want to talk about kids getting rheumatic heart disease? Do you want to talk about the crime crisis we're seeing in Darwin, in Katherine and in Alice Springs that we saw flare up so badly last summer? They're all issues that we deal with here in the Northern Territory. They're just part and parcel of life, and yet, you know, for many of our federal politicians, you know, there's little more than a passing interest in these things. We saw the Voice campaign. We saw $380 million spent on that campaign. We saw the country focus on Indigenous affairs pretty intently for 12 months. And I think it would be disappointing if now that focus shifts to something else, but it does appear that the caravan is moving on already.
Yeah, indeed. But I think you're absolutely right. We do need to stay focused on these things. It's good to always have a chat about them here. But also on the subject of Indigenous affairs, I thought this was pretty interesting because it goes to the heart of, I think, a lot of cynicism that some people have about these sorts of things. WA Premier Roger Cook said the cashed-up environmental groups are intentionally dividing Aboriginal communities and using them to oppose development of major resources projects across the country. Now, I'm not terribly surprised because I think we've all suspected that that sort of thing goes on, but it's a bit of a big admission from a Labor Premier, isn't it?
It certainly is, but I don't think Roger Cook is alone, even within the Labor Party, certainly parts of the Labor Party, in having this view. In fact, I was having a discussion with a former Labor minister in the supermarket yesterday who was saying a similar thing. We're having issues here in the Northern Territory at the moment with the delays that have existed for Santos and its Barossa project. Now, it's been trying to get this off the ground for years, and it keeps running into these hurdles, the latest one being a challenge by a Tiwi Islander, a traditional owner by the name of Simon Munkara, who is complaining that the pipeline, which is 7 kilometres off the coast of the Tiwi Islands, will impact on cultural heritage and Dreamtime stories for his people. Now, most people probably don't know that for many of these projects, to get them over the line, you need the prior and informed consent of a majority of traditional owners, whether that's fracking in the Beetaloo Basin or some of these other resource developments. And yet I think often we see the headline, when people arrive in Sydney and there's a group of traditional owners with them saying, traditional owners oppose this particular project. Well, some of them might, but for the project to go ahead, usually the majority consent of traditional owners has already been agreed. So, I think it's interesting that Roger Cook's making these comments. I think there will be a lot of people, particularly in the resource states, particularly in Western Australia and here in the Northern Territory, who will agree with him. But we are seeing more and more of this sort of environmental lawfare and these projects being delayed as they're dragged through the courts.
Well, Ed, that lawfare that you referred to, that's also going international now, too, because the news has come out that the United Nations is asking Australia to double the money it gives to the UN, which then they figure out how they're going to hand it out to other countries, poor countries, to adapt to climate change, or what they say is climate change. And the UN has also called on the private sector to chip in as well. Matt, there seems to be that domestically and internationally, there's an awful lot of people who want to either pick the pockets of or stop these projects that are going to be hopefully lifting everybody out of poverty, whether they're remote communities in Australia or poorer countries overseas.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that Australia's been called on to do more. Australia gave, only a few weeks ago, announced $150 million in funding for Pacific nations to help them deal with climate change. So it's not like, we're not doing our bit already when it comes to this. We've just seen a lot of discussion at COP28 about what, this country should be doing or that country should be doing. I think Australia more than pulls its weight. I think most Australians would think, well, we need to help out to a certain extent, certainly poorer and developing countries, but at the same time we have pressing issues at home that most people are trying to deal with at the moment, and some serious financial pressures that most families in particular are trying to deal with right now, and they would think that would be the number one priority for our government.
Matt Cunningham, the politics are very tricky with household incomes going backwards and all this money going overseas. Thank you so much for your time.